Hi, welcome to How to RPG. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, but not just Dungeons and Dragons. I want to talk about advanced Dungeons and Dragons because that's the topic for today. We're actually going to cover the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition. This is a review. And I want to say just ahead of time that a patron and subscriber, Dan, was very kind and sent me this very familiar old friend that I gave away like a fool. I should never have given the book away, and I've had to get another copy. This is a review of the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition. Not first, but 2nd edition, with my honest opinion of the pros and cons. And there are, of course, pros and cons to a book like this. So very slowly and carefully, I am going to page my way through this because there's a lot. There's far more than I was expecting. I had forgotten just how large the book was as we transition from 1st ed edition over to 2nd ed edition. So yes, first thing you'll notice is there's a lot of advertising in this book. We'll get back to that. All right. Okay, so as I thumb through this, this is a robust book of Dungeons and Dragons rules, first off. The Player's Handbook was published by TSR and designed by David Zeb Cook, and there's a lot of other people involved in the creation of this book. This book indicates a major shift in how the Player's Handbook was going to be presented to the public from what we had seen in the past. There are 320 pages in the book, which is significantly larger than past publications. The book spine was glue and stitch bound to ensure it survives many years, which is not bad. I'm really glad to see this. The pages are a semi-gloss to gloss finish in white, which means it's a highly detailed but also high quality book. The colour cover artwork is appropriate and awesome, with a barbarian smashing a door apart and the rest of the party behind him. The interior artwork is a wide range of beautiful and evocative depictions. The illustrations are from professional artists that work in classical mediums such as oil and acrylic. Like any great reference book, it has an excellent table of contents and index. Would you believe it? The glossary has been placed near the beginning of the book, which is smart. There's a step-by-step player character generation page, which attempts to make the process quicker and easier to understand, but doesn't quite succeed because the system is still complex. The abilities are explained adequately, but some information has been removed, I noticed, and charisma has been slightly changed to exclude physical attraction, and there may be a few other things that I might have missed that have been removed as well. Ability scores and modifiers work very differently to the modern game, and instead you have a large range of very specific benefits based on the ability score or the modifier that you have. The variety of playable races is still quite small. You still only have human, elf, dwarf, halfling, gnome, and half-elf. There are more classes in this book than have ever been. You get the warrior, fighter, paladin. You get the ranger, wizard, mage, illusionist, priest, cleric, druid, rogue, thief, and bard, which is quite significant as an improvement on a book like this. The classes still have a lot of the important features that they have had at the beginning and creation of the game that has been lost over time. So in this book you will see things like followers and strongholds, and also a lot of utility function that has sort of been missed. Multiclassing has become less restrictive and a bit simpler to deal with. Fortunately, male and female characters are treated the same way with regards to benefits, penalties, and restrictions. Some of these penalties and restrictions and benefits were different for male and female in the past, and they no longer seem to exist. Smart move. Different experience point requirements for character advancement is retained for all the classes, obviously to keep balance in the game, but I'm still not a fan of it. Alignment has a lot of space dedicated to explaining the concept or the concepts of it, and it has excellent advice around alignment. But I do question the real value in building out a role-playing game category or tag name, because really it's more like a descriptor rather than a straitjacket, and often a lot of people get that confused, but they do explain a lot of that stuff in the book. Proficiencies in weapons, tools, and skills is extensive, as you might have noticed, but also optional, which is kind of strange. With so much work being put into it, why would you make it optional? The equipment section offers so much more of everything compared to a modern version of Dungeons & Dragons. I was really impressed. But there is still greater complexity in the encumbrance tables and the movement rates. If you are unfamiliar with encumbrance and movement rates, they do exist here in this game. A remarkable amount of space and effort has been put into explaining magic as well. There is a very general rundown on experience points awarded to a group, but also to individuals, and if you are trained. But I would still say there's a problem when you still refer people to the Dungeon Master Guide for the specifics rather than, like a lot of the stuff is so general in nature that maybe they didn't need to go into quite so much detail and they could have just put it somewhere else, which is just in the Dungeon Master Guide. Combat is by far one of the best chapters in the book, in my opinion. It has specifics, and no longer is it open to interpretation. So you get a lot of the stuff that you need to understand how to play the game. The infamous THAC0 mechanic raises its head to confuse some people, like myself. I still struggle with the concept of THAC0, even though essentially it is reversed armor class. Many of the game mechanic tables are slightly clearer, but still retain complexity with the percentage values and additional information that is offered from this game system. The treasure chapter briefly covers magic items, armor, potions, rings, wands, artifacts, but I have to say I think it's mostly pointless in a book like this, where you're only just going over the general concept. The guide on encounters for players is refreshing as far as I'm concerned, with it covering surprise, encounter distance, avoiding battles, talking to NPCs or non-player characters, waiting for a response, and when to fight. It's great advice. The subtle difference between something like a hireling, a follower, henchman is clearly defined and detailed in this book, and there is extensive information on the player character's obligations, which I'm so glad to see. Sadly, it is missing from modern Dungeons & Dragons, but it's in this book. The limits of vision, visibility, and range, light sources, infrared vision, and even the use of a mirror is discussed in this game. Game time, race movement, or your character movement, movement types like running, swimming, climbing, are all discussed, and it walks you through it quite well. It's clearly defined. Now, the book, I would say, is dominated by spell descriptions, as you might expect. There is a lot of information on spell casting. It's pretty standard in any role-playing game book, or even, Dungeons & Dragons. It's always kind of been that way. There's a lot of spells and so forth. And so there's going to wind up being quite a significant chapter or section of the book. Almost half the book is just spells. Now, much to my surprise, a separate spell name index is included. I don't think I've ever seen something like this other than this book, as well as the general index. So there's two indexes, one for spells and one for general information. The text in the book is no longer small, but a reasonable size, thankfully. The appendix consists of character classes and ability score tables, which would have been better, I believe, in the character class chapter or the ability chapter, where that information is actually being presented. Why put it in the appendix? It doesn't make sense to me. Unless, of course, they're intended to be optional. The blank pages in the front and back of the book are finally removed. They no longer exist. They have been replaced with something else. Dungeons and Dragons advertising. Did we really need that? I don't know that we did, but at least it's not a blank page, right? The book's material and information is really well organized, and I would say this is one of the best books out there, even with the, if you're not fond of red, I like the red headers and definitely when they distinguish the different chapters and appendix in red, and the text size and its layout and how it's presented. And they have the benefit of modern technology here. Obviously, it's not the same sort of thing as what Gary Gygax had to contend with when he was first putting out his book. So there's no fair comparison. But yeah, it's really great to see how well the book came out. I'm amazed by the improvements in presentation from the early advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. And the difference is, I mean, I suppose you would say it's about a decade, but a lot of things can change in a decade. Now, I can't help but notice that this handbook is missing something or a lot. And I suspect it's the input of Gary Gygax and the carryover from Dave Arneson of his contributions to the game system that have sort of been lost here. You'll notice a lot of the spells in this book are very familiar. They are just reformatted, relaid out. Often you'll find that they work pretty much the same way. They may have a little bit more information on them, but often it's just the text has been enlarged so you can actually read it without using a magnifying glass. There's also an aspect to this book that sort of suggests that we are seeing a book presented from people who didn't shepherd or create the game initially, but are sort of like stewards of the game, and so they're trying to do their very best to present it. But again, I also feel like there is some acknowledgement of Gary Gygax's and others' contribution. Dave Arneson is not mentioned at all, which I find a little bit frustrating. But there is also sort of elements that Gary would put in here. I would say some of them are good and some of them are bad, but they are now missing from this book. They have been, I suppose, for that time, sanitized in such a way as to make sure that nobody feels alienated or annoyed in some way. Again, it's still an amazing book. And as you can see, it just keeps going on, unless, of course, I'm just turning the pages too slowly. What I would like to say is a big, huge thank you to Dan. As I said, he is a patron and a subscriber, and he supported me for years. He is probably the person who has contributed the most and been with me the longest out of everybody else who has ever been on Patreon and actually followed my channel. He goes right back, even when he was never playing the game because he just couldn't get a game together. So huge thank you to Dan. I really do appreciate it. So I'm hoping that this review was useful to you. You do not need to agree with what I have to say. My opinion is just my opinion. This is what I had to say about the book. So thank you to my patrons, thank you to Dan, and hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.